Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going straight into one really crucial piece of marine economic research. It gets right to the heart of that conservation versus economy conflict, but in, well, the most remote place imaginable, the deep sea. Our mission today is to unpack willingness to pay to protect cold water corals. It's a key paper led by Claire W. Armstrong, came out in 2019. If you're tracking that balance between economic growth and protecting biodiversity, well, this deep dive is pretty essential.
It really is. And what makes it so vital, I think, is how it frames this fundamental economic dilemma. We're looking squarely at the trade-offs, between protecting these incredibly rich deep sea ecosystems, specifically cold water corals, huge biodiversity there. And on the other hand, these very lucrative extractive activities. We're talking deep sea fishing, petroleum exploration.
Which are big industries.
Huge. And because these coral systems are, well, they're hundreds, maybe thousands of meters down, they're essentially invisible to most people. So they can seem negligible, especially to policymakers focused on, immediate revenue. But they're incredibly fragile, vulnerable to bottom trawling, dredging oil spills.
Okay, right. Let's dig into that then. The core question the researchers were wrestling with is, it sounds like fundamentally human, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are ordinary people, the general public, actually willing to put their own money on the line, real cash, to protect something they'll almost certainly never see?
Exactly.
And maybe even more pointedly, will they do that even if it means potentially slowing down or getting in the way of major established national industries?
That tension is precisely what's driving this push for blue growth, as they call it, this rapid drive to tap into deep-sea resources that haven't been exploited yet. It promises revenue jobs, sure, but it puts immense pressure on these fragile ecosystems, and it really tests our current governance systems.
Yeah, which points right to a pretty serious policy gap, doesn't it? Policymakers, they desperately need solid data on the economic value of these habitats when they're thinking about, say, setting up marine protected areas, MPAs. But the way deep-sea governance works now, well, it often seems like it's not really set up to guarantee conservation, partly because the conversation gets skewed.
Precisely. You have stakeholders from powerful commercial interests, oil and gas, big fishing fleets. Their voices are always heard very loudly when it comes to allocating resources or deciding on protected areas. But the general public's view, especially the sort of non-market value they might place on just knowing these places exist, that perspective is rarely, if ever, properly quantified or, brought into the decision-making process.
Ah, okay, so that brings us to this tricky concept they had to measure: non-use values.
Right. And specifically within that, existence value. This is the benefit someone gets simply from knowing a resource exists. It's totally separate from whether they ever plan to go there, use it, fish it, whatever. And often the general public sees itself as having a legitimate stake, maybe even a moral duty, to make sure these ecosystems are protected for the future. They're really the main beneficiaries of these pure existence values.
Okay, so if you can't just watch what people buy or sell, there are no deep-sea coral tourism tickets, right?
Yeah.
How on earth do you pin a reliable money number on something as abstract as existence value for a reef miles underwater?
Yeah, good question. Since observing market behavior was basically out, the researchers, they went with something called a stated preference method, specifically a choice experiment. It's a well-established survey technique, really, designed exactly for this kind of problem, figuring out values for non-market goods by making people choose between structured options.
Choice experiment. It sounds powerful. But isn't there always a risk with stated preference that people just say what sounds good? Hypothetical bias. How did they make sure people were thinking realistically about, say, a tax hike?
That's a really important point, and they did take steps. First, they used representative samples from two quite different countries, Norway and Ireland. Different economic backgrounds, maybe different cultural ties to the sea. And second, they didn't just do one type of survey. They used both these intensive, deliberative valuation workshops where people got a lot of information and discussed it, and also broader internet surveys. The workshops especially helped make sure people really understood the science and the trade-offs before they made their choices.
Right. That mix of methods definitely adds weight. So what were the specific things people had to choose between? They needed options that really forced that trade-off, didn't they? Environment versus cost, environment versus industry.
Exactly. They set up these conservation options defined by 4 key attributes. Things people could weigh up. First off was the size of the protected area. Simple enough. Options were basically a small increase, like 5,000 square kilometers, or a larger increase, 10,000 square kilometers. This was really designed to get at that pure existence value for the corals themselves.
Okay. And the second attribute, that must be where the conflict really showed up.
Yes, that was the attraction of protection for industry. This basically forced the choice: would you support protecting this area, even if it was also really attractive for commercial fishing, or maybe for oil and gas exploration? That directly measures the willingness to trade off commercial use.
Okay, got it. What else?
The third one, and this turned out to be, well, really illuminating, was the importance of protection as fish habitat. This had levels like not important, somewhat important, or important.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the fourth attribute was the price tag, the additional cost of protection. This was presented as an annual tax increase in Norwegian krone, NKR, and they used 5 different cost levels.
So people were looking at scenarios like option A, pay, say, 500 krone extra per year, get a big protected area that might block some oil drilling, but it's a really important fish habitat, versus option B, pay nothing, industry can go ahead, and maybe the area is only somewhat important for fish. That structure really forces you to value each piece, doesn't it?
Exactly. That's the core of the choice experiment. By analyzing thousands of these choices, they could statistically figure out the marginal value people placed on each attribute, how much extra they'd pay for a larger area or for better fish habitat, or how much compensation they'd need if industry was impacted.
Okay, so let's get to the results. The headline finding was people were willing to pay, right? Even when it clashed with industry. That alone is a big confirmation of existence value.
But you said there was a surprise in the numbers, the actual willingness to pay, the WTP. Yes, the overall willingness was clear, but the magnitude and what drove it was striking. So if you just look at the pure existence value, just making the protected area bigger, the average WTP for that large increase, all else equal, was about NKR 424. That's, a tangible amount people said they'd pay annually just for the corals to be protected down there.
424 krone.
Yeah.
Okay. But that wasn't the big number, was it? You mentioned the functional part?
No, that wasn't the big one. The value jumped dramatically when they looked at the attribute for important habitat for fish. If the area being protected was described that way, the average WTP shot up to NKR 880.
Wow, 880 krone.
Yeah.
More than double just for protecting the structure itself.
Exactly, more than double.
So why? Why such a huge leap? Why does protecting a habitat for fish, which is really an ecological service, outweigh the value people place on just the existence of the coral structure itself? That seems counterintuitive almost.
It really does suggest something profound about what the public values most. This ecological function, the coral, acting as a crucial supporting habitat, it essentially trumped other preferences, even preferences related to commercial activity, and perhaps surprisingly, even the intrinsic value of the coral structures themselves, measured by the size attribute. It implies people are more willing to invest in the, let's say, the operational health of the ecosystem, rather than just preserving a sort of static natural monument, if that makes sense.
Could it just be familiarity, though? I mean, people get fish habitat maybe more easily than they grasp the ecological role of a deep-sea coral structure?
Yeah.
Is it just about relatable concepts?
Well, familiarity might play some role, sure. But the key thing they found, and they checked this with follow-up questions, was why people valued the fish habitat. It wasn't primarily about securing fish for people to catch later that would be a use value. The motivation was overwhelmingly about the habitat's role in supporting marine species independent of any direct human use. So people are valuing the existence of healthy fish populations that rely on the coral. It's like another layer of non-use value, WTP, for ecological integrity, for the life it supports.
Ah, okay. So it's the existence value of the life the coral supports, not just the coral structure. That's a really critical distinction for anyone trying to make a case for conservation, isn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests that maybe the most powerful conservation arguments shouldn't focus only on the sort of abstract wonder of these unseen deep-sea places, but more on their concrete function, like being nurseries, feeding grounds, essential support systems for the whole marine food web.
Okay, but let's add some complexity here, because I assume it wasn't all straightforward support. You mentioned differences between Norway and Ireland. And crucially, what happened when conservation really did bump up directly against industry?
Right. It definitely wasn't uniform support across the board. That's the critical nuance. Yes, there were national differences. Norwegians, maybe reflecting their long history with marine resource management, seemed to value the pure existence of the coral structures themselves a bit more highly than the Irish respondents did.
Okay, and the Irish were maybe less keen on trade-offs affecting industry.
Generally, yes. They showed a bit less willingness to accept conservation scenarios that clearly hindered industrial activities. And this points to the bigger ambiguity around those industry trade-offs overall. While the general WTP for conservation was positive, respondents were really quite split when a specific conservation choice meant directly stopping or hindering commercial activity, particularly oil and gas.
Split how? Like 50-50?
Pretty much. In some key scenarios, about half the respondents actually showed a negative WTP for protection if it meant actively blocking potential industrial development. Which means while people support conservation in principle, if it's framed as a direct, certain threat to jobs or energy or national income, that broad consensus can fracture pretty quickly.
That negative WTP, wow, that's a powerful political signal right there. It tells you policymakers can't just assume blanket public support for MPAs if those areas overlap with existing industry or future energy plans. It forces a much tougher conversation about potentially swapping known market revenues for these non-market benefits.
It certainly does. It really underlines that conservation policies, if they're going to be politically viable, need to carefully manage how potential economic losses are perceived and communicated. But it is important to stress the robustness here. That main finding, the super high value placed on fish habitat, held up across all the surveys. Even the big internet survey done after the 2015 oil price crash, which hit Norway's economy hard. Even with those economic worries, the strong value for supporting marine life persisted.
Okay, so pulling this all together, connecting it to the bigger picture, these findings clearly give a strong mandate for conservation, right? But they also seem to demand a pretty fundamental shift in how we actually govern the deep sea. It sounds like we need that broader ecosystem-based approach that properly weighs up these non-market values alongside the usual market ones.
That's exactly the challenge the authors highlight. Current ocean governance systems are often extremely sectoral. Think about how governments are structured. The ministry handing out oil and gas licenses is often totally separate from the ministry trying to protect the environment.
Right, working in completely different silos, often with competing goals.
Precisely. And that separation leads to really poor integration, especially between, say, fisheries management and conservation policy. If one part of the government is focused on maximizing extraction and another is trying to minimize ecological risk, but they aren't properly joined up, well, these public non-use values that the study uncovered are almost guaranteed to get lost in the shuffle.
So, the way forward isn't just about having the data, which this paper provides. It's about structural reform, moving towards genuinely integrated ocean management.
Yes. This kind of public sentiment, this willingness to pay, provides strong backing for pursuing things like the global biodiversity goals,
Yeah.
the Convention on Biological Diversity, aiming to protect 10% of marine areas. But achieving it requires that integration.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. The key takeaway for you listening is, this deep dive shows the public is willing to pay, to put actual value on conserving deep-sea places most of us will never, ever see. But crucially, that willingness isn't just abstract. It peaks when conservation focuses on the vital ecological function specifically, being important habitat for fish. People seem willing to pay for ecological health.
Which raises a really important question, I think. If the public clearly demonstrates this powerful, quantifiable, non-news value, real value, completely outside the usual market commodity thinking, then how accurate are our current government cost-benefit analyses, especially if they fail to capture the full, long-term socioeconomic cost of degrading these deep-sea systems? There's a huge hidden value there.
Indeed. And considering that significant split in opinion when conservation directly clashes with industry, well, policymakers have this tricky balancing act. The public values existence, but they also fear economic disruption. So, here's the final thought to leave you with. What is the true hidden economic risk of pushing deep-sea exploitation if our policies consistently fail to measure, account for, and integrate the public's deep-seated non-use value for the sheer existence of marine species and the ecosystems that support them? Something to definitely think about as you follow the ongoing debates around marine policy and those complex economic trade-offs.